Somewhere in the parish registers of western and southern France, in towns like La Rochelle, Saintonge, and the mountain valleys of the Cevennes, there is a gap. Not a gap from fire or flood or a missing page, but a gap where a family simply stops appearing under the name it had carried for generations. Then, sometimes decades later, on the far side of an ocean, in a land grant recorded in the Carolina Low Country or a church ledger in colonial New York, that same family resurfaces, still recognizable in outline but wearing a different name. This is the story of that gap, and of the several 100,000 people who created it on purpose, by walking away from their own country rather than surrendering what they believed. They were the Huguenots, the Protestants of France, and when the door home closed for good in the 1680s, many of them changed more than their address. Some changed the sound of the very name they carried into the New World. Genealogists who study the movement estimate that somewhere between 2 and 4 million living Americans descend from this exodus, most of them with no idea that they do, because the name in front of them, White, Wood, King, Revere, Bowdoin, no longer looks French at all. If a surname like one of those sits in your family tree, stay with this one, because it might be the name that traveled the farthest to disappear. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. For most of the 16th century, France tore itself apart in religious war, Catholic against Protestant, until King Henry IV, himself a former Protestant, tried to close the wound in 1598 with the Edict of Nantes. The edict gave France's Protestants, the Huguenots, the right to worship, to hold public office, to fortify certain towns, and to live as French subjects rather than as a tolerated minority waiting for the next massacre. For nearly 90 years that fragile peace held, unevenly and under constant pressure, but it held. Huguenot merchants built fortunes in La Rochelle and Bordeaux. Huguenot craftsmen filled the silk and textile trades of the Southwest. Huguenot families raised their children inside a French Protestant church with its own schools, its own consistories, its own record books, kept in French, listing baptisms and marriages and deaths the way any parish did. Then, in 1685, Louis XIV revoked it. The Edict of Fontainebleau declared the practice of the Reformed religion illegal throughout France. Huguenot churches were to be demolished. Huguenot ministers were given 2 weeks to leave the country or convert. In a measure that still reads as one of the crueler instruments of state coercion in early modern Europe, ordinary Huguenot families found the king's dragoons quartered in their own houses, 2 or 3 soldiers to a household too poor to feed them, sleeping in the family's own beds, eating the family's own stores, with local commanders under instructions to look away from whatever measures their men took to make a household's life miserable enough to sign a certificate of conversion. The French called it, without much subtlety, the Dragonnades. Whole regions of France, Poitou especially, reported mass conversions within weeks of the dragoons' arrival, conversions the crown then held up as proof the policy was working, even as the same regions produced a steady stream of families slipping across the nearest border the moment the soldiers were reassigned. Families who signed were recorded afterward in French parish registers under a specific administrative label, Nouveaux Convertis, New Converts, a classification that followed a household for a generation and marked it as one the state did not fully trust. Leaving was technically illegal. The king who had made it impossible to stay had also made it a crime to go, and the penalty for a man caught trying to flee was the galleys, chained to an oar for the rest of his working life. It did not stop them. Historians who study the Exodus put the number of Huguenots who got out of France in the years around the Revocation somewhere between 180,000 and 200,000, smuggled across the Swiss border in wine casks, rowed out to English ships at night from the coves near La Rochelle, walked over the Alps in winter with what a family could carry on its back. England took in tens of thousands. The Dutch Republic took in tens of thousands more. Prussia's Frederick William issued the Edict of Potsdam within weeks of the French Revocation, specifically inviting Huguenot refugees to resettle Brandenburg, and entire quarters of Berlin still carry the French names of the congregations that answered him. The word refugee itself entered the English language because of this exodus. English writers in the 1680s needed a term for the tens of thousands of French Protestants suddenly arriving on their coastline with nothing but what they had carried, and they borrowed it directly from the French word the Huguenots used for themselves, refugee, one who has taken refuge. Every time the word appears now, in any context, in any part of the world, it carries a French Protestant refugee family's signature inside it, whether the person using it today knows that history or not. A smaller, determined portion of that refugee population kept going, across the Atlantic, to English colonies that were, at the very moment the Huguenots arrived, openly suspicious of anyone who sounded French. England and France spent most of the 17th and 18th centuries at war with each other, on and off, in Europe and in the American colonies alike, and a French accent in a New York tavern or a Charleston counting house in the 1690s was not a curiosity. It was, to English ears trained by decades of conflict, a flag. Huguenot refugees carried one advantage that set them apart from other French emigrants: their religion. They were Protestant, which made them politically legible to English colonial authorities, in a way a Catholic French settler never could be. But legible was not the same as welcome, and Huguenot refugees learned quickly that survival in an English colony meant becoming, as completely and as fast as possible, indistinguishable from an English family. They settled where colonial authorities let them, and where earlier refugees had already put down roots that others could follow. New York took in a substantial wave, many of them former residents of La Rochelle and the Aunis region, and in 1688 a group of them founded a town on Long Island Sound they named New Rochelle, after the port they had left behind. Up the Hudson, 12 Huguenot families, the Bevier, Deyo, Hasbrouck, Dubois, Freer, Lefebvre, and Crispel households among them, received a land patent in 1677 and built a settlement they called New Paltz, laying out a street of stone houses along the Wallkill River that stands today, largely intact, as a National Historic Landmark District, one of the oldest streets in America, still lined with its original houses. Virginia received a formal grant of land on the James River in 1700 for roughly 700 Huguenot refugees who had been waiting in London for passage, and the settlement they built there, Manikin Town, gave its name to the parish that still appears on Virginia maps. Those Virginia refugees had crossed on a handful of ships chartered specifically for the resettlement, remembered in the colony's own records as the Nassau, the Mary Ann, and the Peter and Anthony, carrying families who had been housed in London as refugees, while the Crown funded the crossing as a matter of state policy, since a Protestant refugee population willing to settle inland Virginia was, to English eyes, worth the cost. And south of all of them, in the Low Country around Charleston, Huguenot refugees built what became, in proportion to the size of the colony, perhaps the most concentrated Huguenot settlement in English North America, founding a French Protestant church in 1681, whose congregation is, in an unbroken line, still worshipping in Charleston today. Further inland along the Santee River, a separate cluster of refugee families, the Ravenel, Porcher, Gaillard, and Gourdin households among them, took up rice and indigo land grants and built a second, more rural Huguenot settlement, whose descendants spread across the Low Country for the next 2 centuries, their surnames still common in South Carolina today. Philippe de la Noye was a young Walloon Huguenot who crossed to Plymouth Colony on the ship Fortune in 1621, arriving less than a year behind the Mayflower. His descendants spent the next 2 centuries simplifying de la Noye into something an English clerk could spell without hesitation, and by the 1800s the family had settled on Delano. A president who governed the United States through Depression and World War, Franklin Delano Roosevelt carried that name into the 20th century with no public sense that it had ever been anything but American, until genealogists traced it back across 200 years to a refugee ship out of Leiden. Apollos Rivoire tells a similar story from the opposite end of the colonial period. He arrived in Boston as a young apprentice goldsmith out of the French Huguenot refugee community on the island of Guernsey, and his son later explained, in a letter written near the end of his own life to a Massachusetts historian, that his father changed the spelling of the family name because ordinary Bostonians found the French original difficult to pronounce, and Revere sounded close enough to preserve the sense of it while sparing everyone the trouble. That son was Paul Revere, and the ride that made him a symbol of the American Revolution rode out under a name his own father had already recut a generation earlier so it would stop sounding foreign. The Bowdoin family of the Aunis region split into 2 branches after fleeing to Casco Bay in present-day Maine and then on to Boston, and the split shows up directly in how the name survived. One branch kept a spelling close to the French original and became Boudinot, a name carried by Elias Boudinot, President of the Continental Congress, and later the first Director of the United States Mint. A second branch, settled nearby, rendered the identical French surname differently, and became Bowdoin, a name carried by James Bowdoin, Governor of Massachusetts, for whom Bowdoin College is named. One Huguenot refugee family produced 2 English surnames that today read as though they belong to entirely different lineages. Auguste J. fled La Rochelle after the revocation and rebuilt his life as a New York merchant, and by the time his grandson John J. became the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, the family surname had already been worn down across 3 generations from its fuller French form into the single clipped syllable history remembers. Peter Faneuil, born into a Huguenot refugee family and raised in Boston, built the merchant fortune that paid for the market hall still standing at the center of that city, a name thousands of visitors read every year on a building's facade without knowing it once belonged to a family that had crossed an ocean rather than give up its church. Benjamin Marion settled near Charleston as a refugee, and 2 generations later his descendant Francis Marion became the guerrilla commander the British Army in the Carolina Low Country learned to fear as the Swamp Fox. Henry Laurens, whose father André had rebuilt the family in Charleston after fleeing France as a young man, rose to become president of the Continental Congress and spent part of the Revolution imprisoned in the Tower of London, a Huguenot refugee's descendant held captive in the capital of the country that had first given his family shelter. Not every Huguenot name survived by simplification. Some survived by translation instead, which erases the French origin more completely than any respelling could, because a translated name carries no phonetic echo of the original at all. A family recorded in France as Blanc, the white one, could appear in an English colonial record within a generation as white, with nothing left to show the name had ever been anything else. Dubois, of the woods, became wood or woods. Le Roi, the king, became king. Boulanger, the baker, became baker. Lefebvre and Fabre, both tied to the trade of the smith, folded into Smith, sinking a French Protestant refugee family into the single most common surname in the English language, a disappearance so complete that only the specific surviving church or land record can pull it back out. A Smith, a white, or a king, with deep colonial roots in New York, South Carolina, or Virginia is worth a second look, not because the name proves anything by itself, but because this exact pattern is documented again and again in the records of those 3 colonies, and a common English surname is, if anything, built to hide precisely this kind of history rather than reveal it. Not every family changed the letters of its name at all. In Charleston in particular, a number of the oldest Huguenot families kept the French spelling intact for 300 years while changing everything about how the name was said aloud, so completely that a descendant today can carry a name spelled exactly as a refugee spelled it in 1690 and pronounce it in a way that refugee would never recognize. Legare, spelled precisely as the original French, is pronounced in Charleston to this day as luh-GREE. Huger, unchanged on the page since the 17th century, comes out as yoo-GEE. Manigo lands closer to mane-go than to anything a French speaker would produce from those same letters. Behind those particular names sit documented figures from the Revolutionary War generation, Isaac Huger, who commanded South Carolina troops in the defense of Charleston, and Gabriel Manigault, a Charleston merchant whose personal fortune helped finance the state's war effort against Britain, both men carrying, letter for letter, the same French spellings the refugees who founded their families had used a century earlier. The spelling survived because it sat on deeds, gravestones, and church rolls where changing it would have broken a documented chain of inheritance. The sound did not survive, because the sound was the part that marked a family as foreign in casual conversation, at a militia muster, in a courtroom, and it was the part low country families were free to let go of a little at a time, generation by generation, without ever touching the paper record at all. The pattern repeats across professions and generations well beyond the merchant elite. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, who founded the country's first school for the deaf and gave his name to Gallaudet University, descended from a Huguenot refugee family that settled in New Rochelle and kept its French surname across 2 centuries with barely an altered letter. James Lewis Pettigrew, one of the most respected lawyers in antebellum Charleston, carried a name that traced directly to a French Huguenot refugee ancestor, and became so identified with reasoned, unpopular positions that a well-known epitaph would later credit him alone, among his state's public men, with refusing to follow South Carolina out of the Union in 1860. Names that kept their French shape and names that lost it completely belonged, in the end, to the same refugee population, sorted less by anything particular to the families themselves than by which harbor they landed in, which colony's social pressures they faced, and how many generations passed before a clerk's convenience settled the spelling for good. What you find, if you go looking in the surviving colonial paper, is not usually one dramatic renaming, but a slow slide across 2 or 3 generations, visible only when you compare documents far enough apart in time. A land deed in Charleston from the 1690s might list a French name close to its original spelling, with a clerk's marginal notation giving an English rendering as an alternate. A will filed 20 years later by that same family's children uses only the English form, the French spelling gone as though it had never existed. Parliament itself eventually tried to regularize the pattern. The Plantation Act of 1740 allowed foreign-born Protestants, Huguenots very much included, who had lived 7 years in the American colonies, to be naturalized as British subjects through a simplified colonial process rather than a separate act of Parliament for every family. The naturalization rolls generated under that act, several of which survive in the archives of New York and South Carolina, are full of this exact evidence. A French name entered once in a refugee's own signature, and again in a clerk's official English transcription, and the naturalization record itself is the closest thing to a legal receipt for the moment a Huguenot refugee stopped being, on paper, French at all. This is not speculation. It is the ordinary, unglamorous residue of a bureaucracy processing thousands of refugees who had every reason, political and social, to want the transition finished as fast as it possibly could. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By the middle of the 1700s, in most of these communities, the shift from refugee community to unmarked English family was largely complete, and the forces that drove it were not subtle. England and France were at war for a large share of the 60 years between the Revocation and the American Revolution, through the 9 Years' War, Queen Anne's War, and the long mid-century conflict colonial Americans called the French and Indian War. Every one of those conflicts made a French surname a small daily liability in an English colony, a thing to explain at a militia muster or a courthouse, a thing that could turn a neighbor's ordinary suspicion into something worse. Huguenot families had already proven their willingness to abandon everything for principle once, when they left France rather than convert. Faced with a choice between keeping a name that marked them as foreign in a country now at war with the nation that had exiled them, or folding into the English colonial mainstream without a fight, most of them chose the second option, and they chose it deliberately, generation by generation, inside their own families, without needing a law to force it. The institutions built to slow that process could not keep pace with it. The French Reformed congregations founded in New York, Boston, Charleston, and the smaller Huguenot settlements needed a steady supply of French-speaking Calvinist ministers to keep services in French and keep the community's records in the language its founders had brought with them. That supply ran out. Second and third generation Huguenot children, raised in English-speaking colonies, married English, Scottish, and Dutch neighbors in growing numbers, and by the 1730s and 40s most of the original French congregations outside Charleston had folded into the Church of England or into Presbyterian congregations that kept their records in English. The French Church in New York City held its last service in French in the early 1700s before its congregation merged into the Anglican Communion. The Huguenot Church in New Rochelle followed a similar path within 2 generations. Charleston's French Huguenot Church is, in fact, the exception that proves how thorough this pattern was everywhere else, because it is the only Huguenot congregation in North America that never fully merged into another denomination, and still to this day holds 1 service a year in French. In the spring, a single annual thread tying a living Charleston congregation back to La Rochelle refugees 340 years gone. What disappeared with the language was not the ancestry itself, which continued in the blood and the documented descent whether anyone tracked it or not, but the visible, everyday marker of it, the thing a census taker or a neighbor or a marriage record would have flagged as French. The recovery of that marker, when it happened at all, came almost entirely in the 1800s, more than a century after the original refugees had died, and it came because a small number of their descendants went looking on purpose. In 1883, a group of New Yorkers with documented Huguenot ancestry founded the Huguenot Society of America, built specifically to trace, verify, and preserve exactly the kind of descent this story has been tracing, family by family, back across the anglicized name to the refugee who crossed the ocean carrying the original one. 2 years later, in Charleston, descendants of the Low Country French families founded the Huguenot Society of South Carolina for the same purpose. Both societies still exist. Both still require a documented, sourced line of descent, deed by deed and record by record, before a name is admitted to their rolls, the same standard of evidence any serious genealogical claim requires. What those societies built, over more than a century of work, is in large part a record of exactly the disappearing act this story describes, family by family, the French entry on one side, and the English name it became on the other, reconstructed from wills, land grants, naturalization petitions, and the surviving pages of the old French church registers. Some of that reconstruction came from paper no different in kind from a land deed, and some of it came from something closer to family memory finally written down. Family Bibles, in particular, preserved a thread that official records sometimes lost entirely, a flyleaf listing generations of births and deaths in a hand that occasionally still used the old French spelling of the surname decades after every public document connected to that family had switched to the English form, a private record kept inside the house long after the name outside it had already changed. Where a family Bible or a private letter survives alongside the public record, the two together do something neither can do alone. The land grant proves the family existed and where. The Bible, or the letter, or the account a grandchild wrote down before an elder died, proves what that family still understood itself to be, privately, after the public name had already gone English. The scale of the original population is easy to underestimate. Historians place the total number of Huguenot refugees who actually settled in England's American colonies, across New York, South Carolina, Virginia, Massachusetts, and the smaller settlements elsewhere, somewhere in the low thousands, a few thousand original refugee individuals at most, spread across more than a century of ongoing arrivals. From that comparatively small founding population, 10 to 12 generations of descent, and the ordinary compounding of family trees over 300 years, is exactly the kind of founder effect genealogists point to when they try to explain how a group that small could plausibly be sitting, today, inside the family tree of a meaningful share of the American population, most of whom have never heard the word Huguenot spoken in connection with their own name. This is also where the DNA question has to be answered honestly, because it is the question this channel gets asked more than any other, and the honest answer complicates the tidy version of the story. Commercial DNA tests do not return a category called Huguenot. They cannot. Huguenot ancestry is not a distinct population the way Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry or indigenous American ancestry can register as a measurable genetic signal, because the Huguenots were, in genetic terms, simply French, drawn from the same regional populations of western and southern France as their Catholic neighbors, separated from them by religion and by the record it produced, rather than by anything a laboratory can detect in a swab of saliva. A DNA test taken by a Delano, a Bowdoin, or a Legare descendant today will most likely return a broad estimate of French, or French and German, ancestry, the same result a French Catholic family's descendant would get, with nothing in the raw data to say which side of the 1685 revocation that ancestor had stood on. There is one narrower kind of DNA test that can do more than the broad ethnicity estimate most people are used to seeing. Y-DNA testing, which traces the direct paternal line passed down largely unchanged from father to son alongside the surname itself, can confirm whether two men who both claim descent from, say, a specific Delano, Huguenot, or Pettigrew refugee ancestor actually share that same direct male line by comparing their Y chromosome markers against each other rather than against a population database. That kind of test cannot tell a Smith or a white descendant that their name was once French, because the surname itself has already been translated past the point where a shared Y-DNA result would mean anything without the paper trail to interpret it. But for a documented Huguenot surname that survived intact, Legare, Manigault, Boudinot, Gallaudet, and dozens like them, Y-DNA testing paired with the existing genealogical record can do what the broad ethnicity estimate cannot, confirming a specific documented line rather than a vague regional guess. In this corner of genealogy, the paper record still does the work the genome cannot, and the honest starting point remains a name, a deed, a naturalization petition, or a page in a French church register, not a percentage on a results page. What survives, then, is not a genetic marker, but a set of things you can still go and look at. The 12 stone houses on Huguenot Street in New Paltz still stand along the Wallkill River, built and rebuilt by the Bevier, Deyo, Hasbrouck, Dubois, Frere, and Lefebvre families across the early 1700s. Historic Huguenot Street, the nonprofit that maintains the site today, still gives tours through the Bevier Elting House, the Jean Hasbrouck House, and the Deyo House, furnished and interpreted using the family's own surviving papers. Charleston's French Huguenot Church still holds its single annual French language service every spring, the last regularly repeated thread of the original refugee liturgy left in North America. The membership rolls of the Huguenot societies in New York and South Carolina still hold, family by family, the documented chain connecting an English surname sitting in front of you today to the French one a refugee carried across the Atlantic 3 centuries ago, out of a kingdom that had made it a crime to leave and a greater crime to stay. Go back to that gap in the French Parish Registers this story opened with. It is not empty, it is simply written in a different alphabet of evidence, in land grants and naturalization rolls and family Bibles and the pronunciation of a surname nobody in the family can quite explain, waiting on the other side of the Atlantic for someone to read it correctly. If your family answers to a name like White, Wood, King, Smith, Baker, Delano, Revere, Bowdoin, Boudinot, Jay, Fanuel, Marion, Lawrence, Legare, Manigault, Pettigrew, Sevier, or Gallaudet, and if that family has roots reaching back into colonial New York, South Carolina, or Virginia, the record is there to be checked, deed by deed, the same way the Huguenot societies have been checking it since the 1880s. Somewhere behind an English name that has sat unremarked for 300 years, there may be a parish register in La Rochelle or the Cevennes with a gap in it, and a family that closed that gap on purpose, by crossing an ocean rather than surrendering what it believed. The Mannequin Town refugees folded into the Virginia backcountry in ways still visible on a road map today. Families named Michaud, Tribut, Flournoy, Chastain, Salle, and Bondurant took up land along the James River within the original grant, intermarried with English and Scots-Irish neighbors over the following century, and largely stopped using French in daily life by the 1750s, the same pattern already traced through New York and Charleston. Their descendants stayed concentrated in Powhatan and Chesterfield counties for generations, and the connection never fully disappeared from the map itself. Huguenot Road still runs through the Richmond suburbs today, and Huguenot High School still carries the name a few miles from where the original refugee ships landed on the James 325 years ago, a rare case where the community's original identifier survived even after most of its individual surnames did not. One descendant of that same refugee migration became, with little public notice of the connection, one of the more consequential scientific minds of the 19th century American Navy. Matthew Fontaine Maury traced his line back to the Reverend James Fontaine, a Huguenot minister who fled France and eventually settled his family in Virginia. Maury became the officer known to naval history as the Pathfinder of the Seas, producing the first systematic charts of Atlantic wind and current patterns, work still cited in oceanography today, built by a refugee family's descendant, 2 centuries removed from the parish register his ancestor had left behind. 2 more Huguenot names left their mark on New York in ways many residents pass every day without knowing the history behind them. Stephen de Lancey fled France as a young man, built one of colonial New York's largest merchant fortunes, and became father to Lieutenant Governor James de Lancey, one of the most powerful officials in the colony by the 1740s. The family name survives today as Delancey Street, running through the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a strip of the city seen by millions of visitors and residents each year who have no reason to connect it to a Huguenot refugee's fortune. A few blocks away runs Bayard Street, named for another Huguenot refugee family that arrived in New Amsterdam by marriage into Peter Stuyvesant's own household and went on to hold public office in New York for generations after the English took the colony. By the middle of the 20th century, the work of tracing these families had outgrown any single city or state society. In 1951, the separate Huguenot societies operating in New York, South Carolina, and elsewhere formed the National Huguenot Society, an umbrella organization built to standardize the documentation required to prove descent from a qualified Huguenot refugee ancestor and to coordinate the research across state lines. That organization still reviews applications today, family by family, deed by deed, using the same kind of surviving colonial paper this story has traced from a French parish register to an English signature on a naturalization roll. What all of it adds up to is a refugee population small enough to count in the thousands, scattered across 5 or 6 colonies, that nonetheless left its name behind, translated, respelled, or barely touched at all, inside some of the most familiar streets, institutions, and family trees in the country, waiting for a descendant 3 centuries removed to notice the pattern and go looking for the record that proves it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.